There is a company that got kicked out of the two biggest software clubs on the planet. No Android, no Windows. Both doors slammed shut within the same few years. Most companies would have folded right there and quietly accepted a permanently smaller version of their own business. Instead, this company built an entirely new operating system from scratch. And it is now running on hundreds of millions of devices worldwide. And here's the strangest part of the entire story. The same operating system that started life on phones is now quietly showing up on laptops, in the exact spot where Windows has ruled almost completely unchallenged for nearly 40 years. If this keeps moving the direction it's currently heading, the next big fight in the computer world won't be about phones at all. It will be about who actually controls the software running on the laptop sitting in front of you. What you're about to hear involves a company getting cut off from the two most powerful technology ecosystems on Earth. A 5-year rebuild almost nobody outside one company knew was actually happening. And a plan that is now quietly spreading into countries most people in the West aren't watching closely at all. If stories like this are exactly what you come here for, go ahead and subscribe before we get into exactly how this happened. In May of 2019, the United States government made a decision that changed absolutely everything for one giant Chinese technology company. That company is Huawei, and it had spent years building phones, network equipment, and computer chips used all over the world. The government placed Huawei on something called the Entity List, which in plain terms meant American companies could no longer sell their technology to Huawei without special government permission first. That single decision hit like a wrecking ball landing all at once. Google had to cut Huawei off from something called Google Mobile Services, the invisible engine running the Play Store, Gmail, Google Maps, and essentially every meaningful app on an Android phone. Without it, Huawei's phones sold outside China were still technically running Android underneath, but they felt fundamentally broken to an ordinary user. No Play Store. No Google Apps. Customers noticed immediately, and overseas sales began falling almost right away. At the same time, something quieter was happening on the computer side of Huawei's business. And this is really where the laptop half of this entire story actually starts. Huawei was not banned from Windows in the same dramatic, headline-grabbing way it was cut off from Google services. But new rules made it considerably harder for Huawei to buy the Intel and ARM chips that the overwhelming majority of Windows laptops depend on to function at all. And with the United States government watching Huawei this closely, Microsoft itself became a shaky long-term partner too, not through any single dramatic ban, but through the accumulating uncertainty of doing sustained business with a company under that level of ongoing scrutiny. It wasn't a clean single ban, it was more like a slow squeeze, the kind that makes an already difficult business relationship harder every single year, and one that would eventually push Huawei somewhere almost nobody outside the company expected it to go. What made this moment so different from an ordinary business setback is that Huawei genuinely couldn't simply wait it out or negotiate its way back into good standing. There was no single phone call that could undo an entity list decision, and no amount of money could buy back the trust that Geopolitical had already broken. Executives inside the company understood almost immediately that this wasn't a temporary storm to quietly survive and wait out. It was a permanent shift in how the entire global technology system treated companies caught directly between two competing superpowers. And that realization alone changed how Huawei planned for the following decade of its existence. Losing Google's services and simultaneously facing chip trouble on the Windows side should have been more than enough to genuinely sink most companies of any size. You can't really sell a phone in places like Southeast Asia without Google's apps working properly. You can't easily sell laptops around the world without smooth, reliable access to Windows and the underlying chips that actually run it. Huawei's overseas phone business lost billions of dollars within just a couple of years of the restrictions taking hold. This part of the story matters enormously because it explains exactly why the company had no real choice left but to build something completely new from the ground up. And that new thing is the entire reason we're eventually talking about Windows at all later in this video. Here's where the story takes a turn almost nobody outside the company expected at the time. Instead of treating this lockout purely as a disaster to survive, Huawei's own leadership and the Chinese government watching closely behind them saw it as proof of a much deeper vulnerability they had quietly worried about for a decade already. China's entire technology industry was running on operating systems it did not own and fundamentally could not control. One single decision made in Washington could break a business that had taken decades to carefully build. That's an uncomfortable amount of leverage to hand over to someone else entirely, and it's the exact same underlying power dynamic now playing out again. Just with a different specific piece of software this time around. So just 3 months after the initial ban, in August of 2019, Huawei announced something called HarmonyOS. At first, almost nobody outside the company took it seriously at all. The very first public version actually launched on a television set, not even a phone. And when people who study software closely looked underneath the surface, they found large parts of it were still quietly built on the Android open source project underneath the new branding. In plain terms, it was still running on Google's underlying foundation, just wearing a different name stitched on top of it. Critics called it a rebrand, a stopgap, a political statement dressed up as a genuine product launch. And at that specific moment in 2019, they were largely right to say so. But what almost nobody outside Huawei's own engineering teams understood at the time was that this first rough version was never actually meant to be the finished product. It was a bridge, and bridges exist specifically to lead somewhere else eventually. In this particular case, that somewhere would eventually turn out to be the personal computer itself, the exact machine Windows has owned without serious competition for almost 4 decades running. It genuinely helps to pause here and appreciate just how unusual this level of patience actually is inside the technology industry. Most companies want a big, flashy launch that proves definitively they've already won the moment it happens. Huawei instead let the wider world openly laugh off its first clumsy attempt, fully knowing the real version was still years away and needed time nobody outside the company could realistically rush along faster. That kind of extended patience is genuinely rare in this industry. And it's exactly why so few outside observers saw the bigger picture actually forming until it was already too advanced to dismiss outright as a failed rebrand. Building an entire operating system completely from zero is not something you accomplish in a few months of rushed engineering work. It takes years of patient, genuinely unglamorous effort that nobody outside a company ever gets to see happening in real time. Huawei spent roughly 5 years slowly stripping out every piece of underlying code that depended on Android and steadily replacing it with something built entirely in-house instead. Chinese state media started referring to this broader idea as being self-controllable, which really just means owning every single layer of your own technology stack rather than quietly borrowing someone else's foundation and hoping it stays available indefinitely. That extended rebuild effectively finished in 2024 with the official release of HarmonyOS Next, sometimes called the pure-blooded version internally. And this is genuinely the specific version that matters most for the rest of this story. HarmonyOS Next uses no Android open source project code whatsoever. There is no hidden Android layer quietly running underneath the visible interface the way there was in every earlier version. It is a fully separate system built from the ground up on Huawei's own microkernel architecture. Designed specifically to run across phones, tablets, laptops, smartwatches, cars, and even smart home devices, all functioning as one genuinely connected system instead of several separate ones loosely stitched together after the fact. If that sounds somewhat familiar, it's because Apple has been doing something conceptually similar for years now, linking the iPhone, the Mac, and the Apple Watch together into one smooth, continuous experience. Huawei is now attempting that exact same underlying idea, but at a considerably larger scale across an entire national market, with strong government backing actively helping push the transition forward at every stage. This is also precisely the moment where the phone story and the laptop story finally merge into a single narrative, because the system built specifically to survive without Android turned out to be flexible enough underneath to run on far more than just phones alone. What's easy to overlook here is just how technically difficult this kind of full unification genuinely is to pull off correctly. Getting a smartwatch, a car dashboard, and a full laptop to all speak the exact same underlying language, share identical security rules, and update through one single unified system is not a simple coding exercise anyone can knock out quickly. Most companies never even seriously attempt something this ambitious, because the underlying engineering cost is so high relative to the payoff most executives would expect from it. Huawei took that considerable risk anyway, betting that owning the entire technology stack completely would matter more over the long run than shipping something simpler and faster to market in the short term. There was a genuine cost attached to this specific decision too, worth being honest about. Once HarmonyOS Next fully dropped its Android compatibility layer, it could no longer automatically run older Android apps the way earlier versions quietly could behind the scenes. Every single app developer building specifically for the Chinese market now has to create a genuinely native HarmonyOS version of their app from scratch, or risk being left out of the entire platform going forward. That's a genuinely massive ask to place on an entire developer ecosystem, the kind of demand that would normally scare a company away from making a switch like this at all. Huawei made that trade anyway, reasoning that staying permanently dependent on Android meant staying permanently exposed to the exact same kind of vulnerability that caused so much pain back in 2019 in the first place. Owning your own platform completely, top to bottom, means nobody else can simply take it away from you with a single policy decision made somewhere else entirely. Once phones and tablets were genuinely stable on this new foundation, Huawei pointed that exact same underlying strategy at a machine most people never really stop to think carefully about: the ordinary personal computer. And this is the point where the story stops being purely about phones and starts becoming about something Microsoft itself should genuinely be paying close attention to right now. Here's a number that should worry Microsoft considerably more than any single announcement coming out of Huawei. China is the single largest personal computer market anywhere on the entire planet. For decades, almost every one of those millions of machines has run on Windows without serious domestic competition. That kind of deep structural dependence becomes genuinely risky the moment underlying tension between two countries turns into actual enforceable government policy. And that's exactly what already happened once with Huawei's phone business. Windows updates, licensing terms, and long-term technical support are all ultimately controlled from one single company sitting in Washington state, on the other side of the planet from the customers actually depending on it daily. For Chinese regulators and large state-linked companies, that arrangement is increasingly starting to feel like a single point of failure. Especially after watching exactly what happened to Huawei's own phone business back in 2019 in real time. Nobody genuinely wants their entire national computing infrastructure depending on a decision made somewhere else, by someone else, for reasons sitting completely outside their own control. This is precisely the underlying anxiety that gave HarmonyOS its original opening on phones. And it's now doing the exact same thing on laptops and desktops as well. It's worth pointing out just how much infrastructure sits stacked directly on top of an operating system once a country has spent decades building around it. Banks, hospitals, schools, and government offices all run software that was specifically written for Windows, in some cases going back many years or even decades. Replacing all of that isn't as simple as installing something new over a weekend. It requires rewriting existing software, retraining large numbers of employees, and rebuilding entire systems that were never originally designed with a future switch in mind at all. That underlying difficulty is exactly why Windows has remained so dominant for so long, and exactly why genuinely breaking that deeply embedded habit takes serious, sustained, multi-year effort rather than a single policy announcement. There's also a much simpler, considerably more practical pressure sitting right underneath all of this bigger geopolitical drama. Windows 10 support wound down recently, pushing a large wave of government offices and businesses across China toward a forced upgrade decision they had to make regardless. Beijing has been actively encouraging state offices, banks, and infrastructure operators to treat this exact upgrade moment as the ideal opportunity to jump toward homegrown alternatives instead of simply renewing their existing relationship with Microsoft by default. Timing like that doesn't come around very often on its own. And it lines up almost perfectly with everything Huawei has been quietly building over the preceding 5 years. Put those two pressures together, the underlying political discomfort and the practical forced upgrade cycle arriving at the same moment, and you get a window that feels almost deliberately designed for exactly what comes next in this story. This is exactly where HarmonyOS's ambitions for personal computers actually come into play in the real world. Huawei has already begun shipping laptops running on HarmonyOS, alongside a version of the system built specifically for desktop and office use, complete with office software, file systems, and support for printers and other everyday office equipment most workplaces genuinely depend on. Huawei's first HarmonyOS laptop, still running what the company calls HarmonyOS Next or HarmonyOS 5 depending on the branding used, launched in May of 2025, backed by roughly 2,000 apps already available at launch, with executives publicly describing this as Huawei fully entering the era of HarmonyOS for terminal devices generally, not just phones specifically anymore. These details sound genuinely boring on the surface, but they are actually the deciding factor in whether an ordinary business can switch operating systems entirely without breaking every single workflow it currently depends on to function day to day. Huawei is not trying to beat Windows across the entire world right now, and it might genuinely never seriously attempt to in places like the United States or Western Europe specifically. The actual plan is smaller and considerably smarter than that. With the forced replacement cycle already happening inside China right now, support that push with government purchasing preferences that actively favor domestic technology over foreign alternatives. And use that massive captive market of well over 1 billion potential users to build out a real app ecosystem, a genuine developer base, and durable enterprise trust, all compressed into a small fraction of the roughly 40 years it took Windows to build that same foundation from scratch. Think about how genuinely strange this entire approach would sound applied to almost any other industry you can think of. Imagine trying to build an entirely new car market from nothing, complete with repair shops, spare parts networks, and properly trained mechanics, all within just a handful of years, simply because you decided you no longer wanted to depend on someone else's engine design. That's roughly the actual scale of what Huawei is attempting here, except the product in question is invisible software rather than something physical you can touch and inspect directly, which somehow makes the underlying challenge even harder to pull off successfully rather than easier. This isn't a single dramatic moment the way Huawei's Mate 60 phone surprised everyone and visibly hit Apple's China sales numbers inside a single earnings report a couple of years back. This is a slower kind of siege instead, office by office, procurement contract by procurement contract, aimed first at gradually loosening Windows's grip, specifically on the one market large enough on its own to fund an entirely new software ecosystem without outside help. What makes this particular strategy genuinely effective is that it doesn't need to win everywhere across the globe all at once. It just needs to win decisively in one place large enough to sustain itself financially going forward. And China happens to be exactly that place. Arguably the only place on Earth genuinely large enough to pull this off on its own. Market data has already started showing real movement here too, worth sitting with for a moment. By the fourth quarter of 2024, HarmonyOS had reportedly captured roughly 19% of the Chinese mobile operating system market, actually outpacing Apple's iOS, which sat around 17% over that same period, for 4 consecutive quarters running. Even as Android still maintained overall dominance domestically, with roughly 64% share. So what does HarmonyOS beating iOS specifically, even while both trail Android considerably, actually tell you about how this transition is genuinely progressing? It tells you Huawei isn't just theoretically building an alternative on paper somewhere. It's already meaningfully displacing one of the 2 most powerful consumer technology brands on the planet inside its own home market, using a platform that didn't meaningfully exist in its current fully independent form before 2024. Once that foundation is genuinely strong enough at home, the next question naturally becomes obvious to ask. Does this effort actually stop cleanly at China's own borders? Or does it start spreading outward into markets almost nobody in the West is seriously watching at? Here's the twist that most coverage of this specific story completely misses entirely. This isn't only a story about China anymore. HarmonyOS was originally built to survive without relying on any American software whatsoever. But Huawei isn't only selling it inside its home market by any means. It's actively pushing HarmonyOS-powered devices into Southeast Asia, the Middle East, parts of Africa, and Latin America as well. These are precisely the regions where Huawei's telecom equipment already has a decade-long foothold established, and where governments that tend to be considerably more sensitive about cost are increasingly open to a genuinely cheaper alternative that cannot simply be shut off by outside political pressure the way Google services were shut off from Huawei back in 2019. That's the specific detail that should genuinely worry Microsoft and Google more than any single sales figure coming out of China alone. Every country that already relies on Huawei's network equipment is a country where Huawei devices, and by direct extension HarmonyOS itself, already have an established trusted relationship with the local government in place. This exact pattern tends to repeat itself throughout the technology industry more often than most people expect going in. Whoever builds the underlying network usually ends up shaping what actually runs on top of it, simply because the trust and the working relationships are already firmly established before the software conversation even begins. A government that already depends on Huawei to keep its phone towers and internet infrastructure running has considerably less friction switching its office computers over to that same company's software as well, especially when the price is meaningfully lower and the overall terms feel less risky than depending indefinitely on a distant foreign supplier thousands of miles away. Software independence sells especially well specifically to governments that have personally watched what happens when a powerful country decides another company, or another country entirely, poses too much of an ongoing risk to continue doing business with normally. Huawei isn't just selling an operating system in these particular regions. It's effectively selling a kind of insurance policy against ever being cut off the exact same way Huawei itself was cut off back in 2019. This is the specific piece of the puzzle that turns a regional Chinese technology story into something carrying real global weight. Because insurance like that tends to spread quickly once one government watches a neighboring country adopt it successfully first. And this is where the whole story loops back on itself in a way that genuinely feels almost poetic in hindsight. The very restrictions specifically designed to weaken Huawei ended up becoming the origin story for an entirely separate, self-sufficient technology stack instead. A chip strategy that doesn't need outside foundries, a phone operating system that doesn't need Android, and now a computer operating system that doesn't need Windows either. Every additional restriction added more urgency to the underlying project. Every restriction became one more concrete reason for other countries watching from the sidelines to seriously consider hedging against that exact same kind of dependence sometime in their own future. The Mate 60 phone already proved Huawei could still build genuinely advanced hardware even under heavy ongoing restrictions. HarmonyOS is proof that it can build an entire software layer under those exact same restrictions too. Put those two achievements together, and this stops looking like a simple corporate comeback story. It starts looking like an actual blueprint that other countries and other companies are already studying closely from the outside. A blueprint for building a complete technology stack that cannot be easily controlled by any single outside power, regardless of that power's size or influence. There's something almost inevitable feeling about where this naturally leads from here. Once one country proves it's genuinely possible to build a fully independent chip supply, a fully independent phone operating system, and a fully independent computer operating system all at once, other countries facing similar geopolitical pressure no longer have to wonder whether something like this is even possible in the first place. They only have to decide whether they personally want to follow that same roadmap, which is a considerably smaller, less risky decision than starting completely from nothing themselves without a proven example to study first. Apple didn't lose meaningful ground in China because its phones suddenly got noticeably worse overnight. It lost ground because a determined competitor treated an enormous existential threat like a genuine 5-year engineering problem, and then actually patiently solved it end to end. Microsoft hasn't lost anything significant yet. To be completely clear about where things currently stand, Windows still runs the overwhelming majority of computers across the entire planet today. And that isn't changing this year, or even realistically next year either. But the exact same underlying playbook that quietly chipped away at Apple's dominance inside one single massive market is now actively running against Windows in that very same market, backed by the same sustained government support and the same patient, multi-year approach that made it genuinely work the first time around with phones. It's worth being honest about the real limits sitting underneath all of this too, rather than only presenting the momentum without any caveats attached. HarmonyOS still faces a genuinely difficult app compatibility problem outside China, where the vast majority of the world's most popular software simply doesn't have a native version built for it yet, and building that out for markets beyond China's borders will take considerably more time and developer buy-in than the domestic transition alone required. Enterprise software in banking, healthcare, and government administration often took decades to properly build out on Windows in the first place, and migrating those exact same workloads to an entirely new platform, even one backed by strong state support, is a slow, genuinely expensive process measured in years rather than months. And outside markets where Huawei's telecom equipment has already built up trust over the preceding decade, HarmonyOS still has to compete purely on its own technical merits against deeply entrenched, well-funded incumbents with decades of accumulated developer goodwill behind them. The real question here isn't really whether HarmonyOS eventually replaces Windows absolutely everywhere across the entire world. It probably will not, at least not anytime particularly soon, and quite possibly never across Western markets specifically. The real question is what happens to the rest of the world's broader technology decisions now that there's a genuinely proven, sanctions-resistant alternative sitting right there on the shelf for other countries to consider. An option that countries increasingly nervous about depending entirely on any single foreign power finally have the real freedom to choose instead of their previous default. And once that kind of option genuinely exists in the world, it rarely stays limited to just one single country for very long before others start seriously considering it too. If a company that got locked out of both Android and Windows within the same few years can end up building a genuine software alternative now spreading into dozens of countries around the world, what does that tell you about how durable any single country's grip on critical global technology infrastructure actually is over the long run? Let me know what you think in the comments.